Good evening, I'm Christopher Balzano, and welcome to Tripping on Legends. This is episode 60. I'm calling it Curses and Kids in Arcadia, Florida. I want to welcome everybody who is here on the live show. Just so you guys know, there are several people who are connected to this story who may be calling in at some time during the show. I'm by myself, so I'm kind of manipulating all the equipment here. So if they do, I'm going to bring them in and we're going to see if we can talk about some of this stuff. But it's kind of going old school. And give me a second because I'm having trouble viewing the comments here. It's kind of going old school and new school at the same time. So this was an interesting, to say the least, exploration over the last week, kind of hitting into this. Just so you guys know, tonight I am sporting my Red Sox hat. This is the last, I feel, time that I can kind of represent, seeing that there's absolutely no way they're making it to the playoffs. Their season is essentially done, but as a true fan, you show your love and respect for them even when they completely break your heart. If anyone else wants to call in over the course of the episode, the number is 813-418-6822, and those notes are in the that number's in the liner notes as well, the episode notes. So this is touching upon, in part, what I'm talking about tonight. One of our very first legend trip. It actually is the first legend trip that we organized and was not spontaneous. So if you know the history and if you've been following us since the beginning, or at least gone back and listened to those old episodes, the first thing we did was the Venice train station, right? And the Venice train station was spontaneous. We just decided to go, we went, and we talked about it later. Actually, I think there's like weeks between when we went and when we ended up talking about it. The one that we actually planned, so it's actually episode 4. We're on episode 60. That was episode 4. It was almost 3 years ago. Was to Oak Ridge Cemetery in Arcadia, Florida. So as I was kind of doing my initial, what are the legends of your town, one of the librarians sent me this. And actually, I found out that the librarian was given this information by someone else who I'll be talking about later, who I met with. It was an article in Gasparilla magazine which talked about Oak Ridge Cemetery, and I'm not going to get into Oak Ridge Cemetery too much, unless, of course, you guys want to contribute to the conversation or ask me questions about that one. But I'll get into a little bit because I think it's important to have a little context. So the two main hauntings that were there, or that are there, I should say, that we looked into back in the day. And a lot of this information came from that magazine, but also from a post on Lon Strickler's site, Phantom and Monsters, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And this was David Hose posted an article about Oak Ridge Cemetery and a connected haunting, which I'm going to get into, called, or in a location known as Goat Hill. So in episode 4, we really focused on 2 of the main hauntings. One of which has to do with the Wraith, the Royal Air Force fighters who trained here in Arcadia, Florida. A lot of people don't know that history. When I go around and I talk about, and I go to library events, I talk about the history of Florida and how legend tripping can open that up. And one of the things I mentioned is the fact that the British couldn't train their pilots in the early days of what was for them World War II. We weren't involved yet. And they trained their pilots here in Florida. And so all these British people came over to train in Arcadia, Florida, this little town in Florida, which really kind of boosted the town and kind of allowed it to have a boom. And that first class was in 1941. A lot of this information that we got was Wings Over Florida. I know I'm giving you a lot of information just because it's important to cite things. And so they weren't that great. What ended up happening is that because they came to Florida, a land of plenty, and that was plenty of food, plenty of orange juice, plenty of loose Arcadian women. They didn't train as hard as they would have on their own territory. They couldn't train over there because there was a war going on. They came here, they went from eating rations to all of a sudden having as much food as they wanted. And they really couldn't understand, which I always found an interesting aspect of this. Right now, I don't have access to the chat. So if there's anyone who's like asking anything in the chat or whatever, just let me know because I'm having a hard time seeing it. All right, there I got it. Beautiful. Sorry if I'm doing this here, but I'm honestly trying to get what's going on here and get the comments of people. All right. So I'll do my best to navigate that. I'm not quite sure why it's not allowing me to do that. But so 22. Now I have 23 in my book, so I think I'm going to have to change that when it comes. 22 pilots, I believe, over the course of their training here died. And they're buried in Arcadia. They're buried in Arcadia, Florida, and there's a memorial set up there. If you ever go there, and if you've seen the pictures, I posted some pictures today. And you can actually go into either my public photos or even Tripping on Legends, I think, has a file. That's just all the pictures that we took there when we initially went. You'll see it's an absolutely beautiful memorial. It's the 22 fighters who died, as well as their commander who came back after he died 40 years later. He asked to be buried with his men. So he actually came back as well. So they're all buried there. If I seem like I'm distracted, it's because I'm trying to get access to the comments. I can see them, but not really well. So I'm not really sure why. I'm going to try to post something and see if I can. I know this is, for the people who are listening on podcasts, this is going to seem really annoying, but there we go. All right, so their ghosts are still seen at that site. So we went there. We tried to get them to communicate with us. One of the things we did was we left memorials for them. We left pennies for them on their grave because that was a sign of respect and a sign of memorial, but also we didn't know them personally. So I guess the thing is that if you don't know them, if you know them personally, you're supposed to put different things, if you serve with them, all that kind of stuff like that. We left pennies to kind of see what was going on with them, and I'm seeing if this works. I can actually see the comments better if I do it like this. So oddly enough, I'm going to have myself up here so I can see some of the comments. So now I see them. All right, good, beautiful. Sorry about all of that. We went there. One of the things that you're all supposed to see is the Union Jack, which used to be lowered and raised daily. When the initial person who was in charge of that died, no one took over for them. And so it stays up at all times. Now, the weird thing is that people have gone to that cemetery and the flag disappears. The Union Jack disappears, and they're left with just kind of wondering where it went and walking around. There's been reports of air battles, or at least hearing jets where there are no jets. We went there. We got a lot of interesting noises, some of which may have been motorcycles, but by the way they sound, it's not necessarily consistent with what a motorcycle sounds like. We also, and then the second one, which really is what drew us to the cemetery, was a Talking Mary statue. So in the cemetery, there were reports of this Talking Mary statue that children especially have had conversations with, especially female children have had conversations with. And they've had entire conversations, so it's not like they just heard like a whisper or something. And we tracked it down to maybe being Bertie Hollingsworth, because Hollingsworth is where the statue is, and it guards over it. It's actually kind of interesting if you go there and if you look at the pictures. She's in a position, the statue, where she's looking out over the graves as if she's watching them, as if she's attending them. And we do a really good job in that episode talking about the importance of the Hollingsworth family to Arcadia, but also kind of what this might be. And we kind of look into some of the different stories about in terms of, oh, this says it's just a hornet's nest, and we actually got some really interesting audio there. And like I said, it was the first official legend trip we took. And that was episode 4. Yeah, episode 4. Wow. There's more activity in the cemetery. one of the things that I think we established informally pretty early on, and then formally later, is the idea that spirits and ghostly legends that involve children are somewhat off limits. And so there was another element to the hauntings there that we glossed over very quickly. Just talking about in terms of the context and things like that. I'm going to go back to that story tonight because it connects with another story that I'm talking about. So in 1967, all seven of the Richardson kids, who were a local family in town, were murdered. They all died. They all got sick over the course of 24 hours and died. When they did the autopsy, when they got into what might have killed them, they found out that they had been poisoned. The attention immediately went on to the father, whose name was James Richardson. And he was convicted of all 7 of their murders. And it ended up years later, decades later. So he served, I can't remember, I think it was 19 years in jail or something like that. I did this research for a book, for my book that's coming out. The next door neighbor, whose name was Bessie Reese, she confessed to the crime. She confessed to the crime when it happened. But on her deathbed, she confessed to it again and was very explicit about what had happened and how she had done it. Now, the weird thing is that she wasn't really at the time considered a major suspect because she was known to be a little bit loony. And so she was suffering from mental health disorders. I don't mean to minimize mental health disorders, but I'm going by like the old writings about her. And so no one took her seriously when she said that she had done it. They thought when she confessed, she was blaming herself because she was the one who was babysitting them at the time. And so they felt the confession, which she very quickly retracted at the time, was more of like, oh, they were my responsibility and I killed them by not being supportive, by not like, when actually she was really kind of confessing to it. So she confessed to it again in detail on her deathbed and eventually got him released from prison. It's interesting though, because in researching the book, I went back and I went back and read the newspaper articles, especially as he was going on, like after he had already been in and they were potentially going to release him. And there was no way this man should have been convicted. The first thing that kind of has to be said, which is weird because it's not mentioned anywhere in the ghost story part of it. And I did research for a while before I was like, oh shoot, he's black. And so he kind of got railroaded, and we've kind of explored this racial aspect to some of these legends. And it's something that you have to keep in the background of what you're doing here in Florida, especially, that he was convicted basically because he had no money and no respect within the community to defend himself. And so that's why he went to prison for this, even though someone had confessed, and some of the things that were really heartbreaking, because this happened, I think in the early days of December, is that when people would talk about him and talk about his kids, and this is really heart-wrenching, he had already put, because he didn't have a lot of money, he'd already put down payments on their bikes for Christmas. He had bought all of them, the ones that were older, bikes. The kids were in the age of 2 to 8, so 7 kids, 2 to 8. He was known to brush the little girl's hair. It was joked about. It was joked about amongst the neighbors that the fights that he and his wife got into were almost always about the fact that he would sneak them candy when she didn't want them to have candy. Like all of the aspects of the case point to a man who really loved his family, and it really is a case of railroading. Even before he was released from prison, though, people were already starting to talk about the spirits of those children playing in Oak Ridge Cemetery. They're buried in Oak Ridge. We avoided we avoided looking for them, although it's clearly marked, like if you go in there, where the children are. But their ghosts are seen at that site. One of the stories that I came across involved them of kids playing in the cemetery, which we already talked about, like the kids go in the cemetery, so it's in the middle of a rural neighborhood, not knowing that they were ghosts and playing hide and go seek with them, like being asked to, like, the kids would like start to hide and they would think it was a game and they would play with them and the kids would just completely disappear. People have reported for decades ghost lights there. And these ghost lights, unlike other ones that float, or the ghost lights seem to be playing with each other and interacting with each other, almost as if in death these 7 children, because they all die at the same time, because they all are together, and all their energy was kind of released at the same time. They're still in proximity. Maybe they still need each other. The kids are known to play with each other, both in physical form, like seeing the little kids playing, but then also these ghost lights. Another place that is attached to it is a little ways north, and this is private property. So when I was going to, I wanted pictures of it for the book, and I was like, I tried to get close to the area that is known as Goat Hill. And if you go to Arcadia, or if you just type in Goat Hill Arcadia, you'll see that it's a road, like it's a genuine place within there. And then set above everything is a hill that's known as Goat Hill. So it's called Goat Hill Road, I believe. And then there's this hill, and then there's a tree on top of it. The lights have been seen going back and forth between the cemetery and Goat Hill. There was one report I came across where someone actually, it was like dusk, and they were watching it, and they were looking out towards the cemetery area, and they were kind of underneath the tree area. This is before it was kind of closed off, and the lights almost became like a sunrise. They described it as the light kind of rising up, and there was these bright lights coming up over the hill that then flashed and just became these orbs of light flying all over the place. Now, people haven't said there's exactly 7 or whatever it is. And like I said, it does range from 2 to 8. So, but people have definitely seen these ghosts going back and forth between these 2 areas of the cemetery, between Goat Hill and the cemetery itself, and they attribute it to those children. We've talked about this on the show, and you can kind of go back and listen to some of them. I think we even did a live show on it entirely. Children are more likely to be ghosts than adults. I know that sounds really weird, but there's something about, and anyone who has spent any amount of time with children knows the energy that they release just being children, right? There seems to be a lot of that just kind of explodes at a moment's notice. Think about, the best example is a kid pulling a tantrum. Like, they can produce a lot of energy very quickly. But there's also this idea that unlike other spirits, they can't find peace as easily, or they can't find their way to the other side as easily. They don't have a frame of reference for dying, or a frame of reference for moving on. And so they linger, and their energy is so high, and their ability to follow directions, as you know if you have kids, is so low that they stay. And it accounts for, at least on the pseudoscientific side, why there might be so many reports of children. Now, before I get to the other part of it, I just want to talk about the Samuel West House in a Sonnet, which I've talked about a few times, and if you've heard me on Spooky South Coast or read Ghosts of the Bridgewater Triangle, you might know the story a little bit better. I actually see some of the people who are in the chat room have been to that house, so I know that they'll know what I'm talking about. But I went in there with Mike Markowitz, and we set up. This is back in the investigation days, and we set up all of these highly sensitive. And if you know Mark, he's known as the EVP guy because he's just amazing with it. All these microphones, and then we went out to the fire pit and talked to the homeowners for an hour and a half. I just let it record, and we got some of the most incredible, amazing EVPs that I've ever heard in my life. not because of their clarity, not because of their type A or whatever it's called, but because of what they were saying. These voices were interacting with each other. And one of the ghosts that's there is an old grandmotherly figure, and she yells at the ghost kids because they just run rampant and do whatever they want. And they don't know the rules. They don't know the rules of being a ghost. I know that sounds really weird, but there seems to be, according to those recordings, and there are dozens of voices that are talking to each other. At one point they say, shh, they're listening, they're recording, things like that. And there's instances of kids talking and then an old woman hushing them down. And seeing something to the effect of like follow the rules or something like that. So there is this weird idea that there are things that are supposed to be done in the afterlife, but kids don't necessarily know them or don't follow them. They don't know how they're supposed to act. There you go. That's the pseudoscientific side, right? So we take that and you put it over here. And then the next part of what you have is this idea that we as people can't process the death of a child, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why we at Trivia and Legends have never really done a lot of child legends, right? Child ghost stories, because it's too horrific. I mean, if you think about this story, and it's a real story, right? Like that's you have to hold on to it. This is something real. The idea that anyone would poison 7 children is horrific. We can't process that. Not only can we not process that, we don't want to think of that because we have children, right? Because they are our legacy. And so when we hear about the death of a child, it hits us harder than just hearing about someone who has passed away. Obviously, anyone dying, if you love them, if you don't even know them, is a tragedy. But it seems like it's even worse when it is a baby, right? So I give an example of you don't hear any reports of the World Trade Center bombing. The Oklahoma City bombing without them mentioning the daycare, right? And people are almost desensitized to how many people McVeigh and I can't remember the other guy's name, how many lives they took. But then when you hear that part about and then the daycare also went up, it hits you harder, right? And we think of him as this horrible person in history, but almost in a pushed off kind of way. And then you hear that line about how he, before he went in, was like making eye contact with the kids on that floor and like waving to them before they did. And then he becomes a monster, right? So kids have that ability to make anything more intense. It only makes sense that we would, whether it's our need to explain it or whether it's our need to have hope that there's something for them, even in the afterlife, or just the emotion and the grief of that, causes us to make up more stories about ghost children as well, right? We need to get that out, whatever that emotion is, whether that emotion is sadness or whether that emotion is guilt or whether that emotion is like just unable to process the tragedy. And so we develop them around it. And I noticed Colleen in the chat room has talked about the ghost in the Borden house, which, people talk about Lizzie and they talk about Andrew and they talk about potentially Bridget and all the spirits that are there. And it's almost adventurous. It's not almost adventurous, it is. But then when they talk about the spirits of the children who are there, it gets a lot sadder. And I know that we went there once and we actually set up a xylophone and it played it. And then we went up again and they had spilled all the toys in the toy box all over the place. So I'm very familiar with the Borden house ghosts, children ghosts. And if you haven't, so Colleen, if you haven't, or anyone else, if you haven't read the story in Haunted Objects about the Borden children ghosts, like you really need to read it because it's a very interesting story that involves Jackie Barrett and some other So we didn't explore this. So I can't say, I mean, it's not in that episode what we did if we went to those graves, if we tried to communicate with them, if we tried to play hide and seek. That seems like a really cool legend trip if you take the kid part aside, or you can process that at least to be like, let's go play hide and seek and see what happens. Like, that seems like it would be a cool kind of legend trip thing to do. In revisiting this for the book, I came across a lot of, in reading Lon's site and what David Hose had published, this idea that Arcadia is another one of those haunted epicenters, right? It's another haunted town. There are so many ghost stories that are coming out of it, and there are so many ghostly legends that are coming out of it that it seems to be part of the complexion of the community. And I wanted to touch a little bit of that. A, because it's really close. B, because I already had some foothold in there. And so, if you look at just the known ones, the ones that I've experienced, so we're talking Goat Hill, we're talking Oak Ridge Cemetery. A little while ago, I published a picture when we went there for, I can't remember what we were there for, and we, Ella and I took a picture at the haunted opera house that's there, which once again involves children, because these children supposedly died in a fire, but that is not true. I found out this weekend. Today I was just talking to David Hose, and he talked about a hearse that I hadn't heard that story yet. There seems to be, for what is a small town, not physically, it's actually pretty expansive when you're talking about like just square miles, but almost all of it is just orchards, orange groves and things like that. If you've been there, and I've posted pictures of it, it is in a beautiful historic town, right? The downtown area has amazing antique shops, and it's got this real feel to it. I think when I was married, we used to go through Arcadia going from Orlando to here, and I think I'm pretty sure that's where my ex-wife got her speeding ticket, her only speeding ticket in Florida. There are all these sites in there and all these stories coming out of there for such a small place that you have to start to wonder, is there something about Arcadia? Is there something about these certain towns that are more haunted than others? And obviously it's something that I've explored in Dark Woods and the Bridgewater Triangle aspect of things. It's something that I'm exploring in terms of the Ocala Forest. But Arcadia seems to be one of those spots that just breeds it. I'm going to fast forward a little bit, and I'm going to go back to this idea, but I want to introduce one of the people who I met in Arcadia. So I went there on Saturday looking for Coker Cemetery, and I decided to stop into the Historical Society because this name, Carol Mailer, kept coming up time and time again when I was doing my research. And the society is only open every other Saturday, and it just happened to be a Saturday that I was free, right? # follow the signs. And so I was able to meet her, right? And it's great because I recognized her almost immediately from her pictures, and she's this great character. I wanted to take a picture of her so bad, but she was kind of like a little sketchy on me doing that, so I didn't. But I ended up, if you love history, you're going to love this. I walk up, and there are all these teenage volunteers, and half of the teenage volunteers are clearing wood, like trees that have been chopped down, and the palms. If you're from Florida, you know what I mean about the palms falling all the time. They're clearing that, and the other half, I literally walk in to talk to her, and they're outside, and there's like 5 teenagers who are restoring and cleaning record books, tax record books, these huge books like this big of tax records. And one was doing 1968 and the other one had 1939. And they were literally these teenagers out there restoring it. I was like, this is amazing. This is exactly what I love, right? And so I ended up going into kind of the heart of this Historical Society. and I'm literally surrounded by artifacts. I posted a picture. Actually, it's part of the. I'll try to post the original picture, and it's an old school ball that a prisoner would wear on his ankle, right? And as I'm talking to her, we're sitting on these chairs that were when Arcadia used to be the center, used to be the county chair. I'm not sure if it still is, but back in those days, it stretched all the way along. If you remember Indian Springs, we talked about how Arcadia, that's kind of where they brought Isaiah Cooper to hang and all those things. It literally is like was what we consider Southwest Florida was DeSoto County, and Arcadia was the seat. And so these are the actual jury chairs from the courthouse from way back then. And I'm sitting, I'm like, wow, I am sitting in history. And we ended up talking for almost 4 hours, just about Arcadia and some of the history of Arcadia. And she wasn't a big believer in ghosts. She said, oh yeah, sometimes ghost people come. And I guess they did an episode of like something like haunted towns there. And they talked about some of the different things. And so she's like, but I'm a historian. Like, I talk about facts. Like, what can I prove? Things like that. But one of the things that she was able to touch upon is that this idea that we've explored about how there are two histories that coincide with each other. Oddly enough, I'm just going to answer a question that was in the chat room. Oddly enough, Dave, not a lot of water there whatsoever. It seems to be, at least in the main part of it, the most landlocked town I've ever been to. It does have the Peace River nearby, and it does have Joshua Creek nearby, but it's not some place that you would say, and all of these locations I'm talking about are void of water. Just to talk about that. This idea that there are dual histories, right? And there's the history of what's in books and what's facts and what's provable and what is the town narrative, like the official town narrative. And then there's the folklore part of it, right? Then there's the folklore, which is also the history of the town. And that is in the form of colorful characters or incidents that happened. And this is kind of where you get this idea that, you need both of them to get a complete history of a place, right? And Arcadia, for all of its recorded history, which once again, being the town, the county chair has everything's written, right? I mean, there are teenagers out there cleaning books from 1939. They embrace that that folklore aspect of their history as much, and that's an active part of their narrative. So she talked about a lot of, and I'm going to do more research on this and do an official episode about this, but just these colorful characters that are part of the fabric of what is Arcadia. And so when you sit and you talk, sometimes there's one or two, but she was going on and on and on about these stories. And every time I would say, oh, but what about this place in town? She would say, well, let me tell you about that place in town. The story is that old Joe. So not necessarily ghost stories, but tons and tons of folklore, these real figures in the town who have become, who have gained folklore status and who kind of are the legends of the town, and that legends and those stories run so deep that it's the history of the town. In talking with her, I was very directed on what I wanted. And then I just released it. I was actually listening to an episode of another podcast, which has nothing to do with ghosts. And she talked about how she used to be a photographer. And when she went in there and she would say, oh, I want you to do this, this, and this, she would ultimately get into conflict with the people she was taking the pictures of in horrible pictures. But if she let them think that they had suggested it, like if she just let them take the pictures they wanted and then went, what would look good? How about if we try this? The people loved it. She got great pictures. And ultimately, they almost always chose the ones that she had taken over the ones that they had suggested. And so it kind of had that same idea. I want to know about Coker. I want to know about the ghost, but I let her talk and I let her do kind of her thing. And every once in a while, I would lean it back, and we ended up having some really interesting conversations. She said she doesn't want the audio released, so I won't be able to like edit that up and put it out there, but definitely some of the content I'll put out there and kind of do a separate show on just some of the colorful characters and historical things we talked about. She gave me a really interesting perspective on where and how the next haunting I'm going to talk about might have come about, or what it means, or things like that. So in doing my research, I came across a posting, and I think this was reposted on Lon's site as well, but it was from a Facebook page, which seems to now be defunct. They haven't posted in almost 5 years, called Arcadia Ghosts, Haunts, and Paranormal Folklore. And I put the link on, but honestly, like most of the stuff there is not relevant to what we're talking about. And the part that I'm going to say tonight is pretty much all inclusive of what they've got for it. There is a cemetery, and I'm going to use the term loosely. It's really just a collection of headstones known as Coker Cemetery. Spoilers, I couldn't find it. If you saw my live post, I couldn't find where the cemetery was. Carol gave me a better geographical idea of where it may be, but by the time I was out there, and because I wasn't taking notes because I was recording it all, I couldn't get access quickly to the audio to find it. So I went with, I checked out a few of the places that are mentioned as being Coker. I'm not sure if any of them actually were. So it's like finding a headstone in a haystack, right? And I wasn't really, I was on my own. It was actually the first hiking trip I've done like completely on my own, other than Mayaka, which was a little different. And so I wasn't able to find this cemetery, but there are conflicting reports. So everything online, which might date back a few years, says that Coker is an abandoned cemetery. And that the only headstones left are of the Lott family. Carol said that that wasn't necessarily true, that a few years ago, an anonymous donor paid to have the entire cemetery taken care of. And so it's actually more headstones than those three. If you look at the official records, they have, I mean, you know, I can't remember the exact number, but they've got dozens of headstones and names listed there. So according to her, it's been restored. That said, it's still far into private property that is an orange grove. Now, it's interesting because the websites that talk about it say, it's a grove, it's in the middle of a grove, but don't worry about it. They're cool about it. The owner doesn't care unless, you know, unless you vandalize or disturb the groves. And all you have to do is lock and unlock the gate before you leave. I got out there. There are plenty of gates. None of them are accessible. I mean, you could hop them, but none of them are accessible by car. Like, and they're all locked. These people, this is their living. I was out there for about 2 hours looking at different locations. In those, yes, it is on Find a Grave. In those locations, 2 hours, I didn't see anybody. There was no one protecting. There was no one protecting them. There was no one monitoring them. It was a Saturday afternoon. I don't know if that's different. She said and this is kind of why I feel like I wasn't in the right location. She said there was a house nearby, and that person was either formally or informally in charge of watching the area of the grove where the cemetery is. And he famously, everyone always would say that, you know, he always carried a shotgun on the front porch, that it was one of those places you didn't want to go to. Either way, I wasn't going to go on private property because that's not what we do. So I decided to hold off a little bit, and try to get permission. She said, go there, find who owns the land, ask. These were her words. Ask, like send a letter, call, request that you go on, explain what you're doing. They might be okay with that. She suggested I send a letter And then if no one responds, go and say, but I sent a letter. I was just waiting for a response. I thought it was okay. So, but either way, I wasn't going to officially do it. But I want to get into what actually is the legend at Coker Cemetery. And I'm hoping that as I talk, I don't even need to explain the folklore aspect of this. Like, it's just going to be like, oh, yeah, and that probably means this. There are 3 headstones that are visible in all of the stories. And that's of Nellie Ray, Nellie Ray, Frida May, and Mary Lucille, all of which are the Lott family. Those 3 children all lived less than a year. So these are the headstones of 3 babies. The backstory is this. And it's slightly different depending on, you get what I'm saying. The main story is a outsider, often referred to as a tinker, or a traveling salesman, or a traveling tinker, came to the Lott family farm, and they were pretty hard out. They were poor, and he offered his services. They took him up on his offer. He did some work around the farm, and when it came time to pay, they refused. And he pulled out his shotgun, and he told the guy to leave, or he would, bury him. And the man left. And as the man left, he kind of looked to Mother Lott, who was pregnant, and said something to the effect of, I curse you and this family. You will never have another child that will see the age of 1. And then goes away. She loses the child that she is currently pregnant with, which in theory would be Mary, within the first year. And then in 2 next years, 1920, Nellie is born, and she dies before she's a year old. And then Frida's born in 1924, and all of them are buried there, all victim of the curse. And the Lott family was so distraught and so destroyed by this, they realized the only way to break the curse and to be able to get clean of it was to leave town. And so they left the town altogether, leaving behind their 3 babies in this cemetery to kind of fend for themselves. That's the basic story. Now, the elements that change are who the tinker is usually. Some of the stories say that the tinker was an outsider, but also black. And then some say that he was Jewish. And then other elements of the story say that he was a gypsy. All 3 are classic urban legend, classic folklore scapegoats. All of them symbolize the idea of the outsider, right? So an outsider, be it black or Jewish or gypsy, comes into town and curses them. There's another part of the story. This is hot, so I'm going to take a... Sorry. There's another variation of the story that says that, what's going on, Lorraine? That the tinker came to town, was working on the farm, and he and the wife had an affair. And once again, things kind of play out, and he said, my child will die, and you'll never be able to have another child. I don't mean to be smiling when I say this, I'm just, because I was joking. So you have all these elements of a great folklore story, and it's not hard to tell how this could develop, right? You have these 3 graves of 3 children, and no other family members are buried there, right? Carol and I went back to the records, and we find that, you know, in whatever it was before, like pre-Mary being born, they are part of the census. Post Frida dying, they're not part of the census anymore. So the Lot family, which seems to have one or two fingers in some influential things for a few years in that area, disappear from the town records. They're not part of the town complexion anymore. They're gone. So you have a family who's gone. You have these graves set aside. You have this, what would be unfortunately somewhat normal thing, although 1920 and 24, these are late dates for this to be happening, but you have 3 children who died very young. What is the reason for it, right? What is the reason for that? And so it seems really not far-fetched to actually have a story develop that an outsider comes to town, puts a curse on them, and they all die. And that's what forces the family to leave. Because really what it's saying is, don't trust outsiders. Don't let outsiders into your house. You know, and that's a classic folklore, a classic urban legend motif, this idea that, you know, you'll be fine if you keep it within the family, but once an outsider invades the town, and Arcadia is a small town, it doesn't necessarily like its outsiders, right? Once that happens, you open the door for bad things. If you want to be a good family, don't let the gypsies in, right? If you want to lead a good life, you got to be careful not to let those Jews into your town because they're going to wreck things. Now, I asked her whether this was a common theme in other stories in the town, and she was able to say outsider, yes, but not one particular group. So it's not, and I think she was very protective of this idea that the town is racist or something like that. One of the things she talked about was the tree of knowledge. So if you know anything about Arcadia, they have this famous tree of knowledge where, if I'm trying to get the backstory correct on it, 2 people were born next to each other, and they each grew a tree, like to celebrate that the child had been born, and one of them grew up big and tall, and people would for years would go to the tree of knowledge, and they would speak truth, like politicians, right? So that was a big thing. You go to the tree of knowledge. And over the years, because they have like ghostly sightings there too, over the years, it had gained a reputation that it had been a hanging tree, right? That it had been some places where lynchings had occurred. And she wanted very clearly, as we're talking, she's like, if you could do one thing for me when you talk about Arcadia, can you make sure people know the tree of knowledge was never used to hang an African American? And I was like, I will communicate that. And with that, she was able to say, but there's like 3 other trees in town that are known for that, but they're all out in the woods. Like, and we talked a little bit about why were they out in the woods instead of in open public, and you know, it's this idea that these dark elements of town's histories, and they want to keep them under wraps. But you also have to acknowledge that they exist, right? So she was able to kind of communicate that yes, there is an element in a lot of these stories of town pride and outsiders not necessarily being good for the town, but not necessarily one group, and not necessarily in a racist kind of way. Like, it's kind of that thing, like, I don't hate you because you're racist. I just don't like anybody. There was a little bit of element to that, to it. What is the ghost story, though? Right? So we have the background. What is the ghost story? This has been harder to get a handle on because most of the people who were part of those initial postings are no longer active, and so I couldn't communicate. But the idea that I got was this. Again, famously ghost lights, giggling, which I think is really odd because, as far as I know, I have 2 kids and I've babysat my nieces and nephews and a lot of people. Babies cry, right? But this is more of like child giggling. Now, the weird part of it is this. Not that those aren't weird. The story that's past is that if you are down on your luck, if you have bad luck, if bad things are happening to you, bad karma, you go to this location and you put pennies on the graves of the 3 children. And when you put pennies on those graves, your luck changes. Like there's something about these abandoned children that grant luck, that wash away your sins, that going there and acknowledging them allows you to get rid of all that bad stuff that's been keeping you back. So obviously it was very appealing, right? Because everyone's got stuff that everyone thinks they have bad luck, right? And if you know me and if you followed me on anything, you know that I've got the worst luck ever, right? And so it was very appealing to find this cemetery and try to wash myself of that. But I also noticed that it tied into Oak Ridge, right? Oak Ridge has the ghost lights. Oak Ridge has the children. Oak Ridge has the idea of the coins and placing the coins on the graves. I don't know where this idea of changing your luck comes from, right? But it is one of those things that's repeated in several other posts. So people talk less about the ghosts and seeing them as much as they do about how people would go there. Now, I don't know if that's to draw people to this abandoned place so that someone is out there loving these children when no one really does. But there's definitely an element of we need to care for these kids, and then they'll care back for you. Whether that's altruistic, like you're going there just to get something from them, but at least like you're paying them attention. This is definitely a legend trip that I want to follow up on. I want to get a better handle on where Coker Cemetery actually is. I want to explore the idea. Like I said, Carol Mayer says that the cemetery is now maintained. You can't go on it, or it was maintained, it was cleaned up, and that there's more than those headstones. The legends say that there's only those 3 headstones. This is definitely something, especially given this idea that I want to understand what is going on in Arcadia. I want to explore this idea. I definitely want to follow up on the hearse legend that I heard today. But it's so close to where I am, and there's such a rich thing there, and Carol was so amazing that I feel like this is one of those ones that's going to involve research, but it's going to really be worth it when I get out there. I don't know if my luck is going to change. I don't know if I'm going to be able to communicate with the children or experience that. But especially given that that Oak Ridge and Coker are maybe 15 minutes away from each other, it seems like something that I can revisit, maybe try to get into Goat Hill again and hit this one. So it is one of those things where it's definitely a follow-up one. I just may have to make sure that I'm wearing jeans and I'm wearing plenty of bug repellent, because the grass was like up to my chest on that. So I'd love to get your opinion on that. If you've heard other stories from Arcadia, or if you've heard other stories from that part of the state that might link into that, I would love to hear that kind of feedback. You can email me at spookybalzano@gmail.com. I'm sorry, spookytripping@gmail.com. Spooky Balzano is my Twitter. The Instagram is also Spooky Tripping. So if you're following us, really the kind of dumping spot for everything that we're doing is the Facebook. So it's facebook.com/trippingonlegends. I also very quickly, I'm going to show this again. Whoop. See that? That's actually, I believe, yeah, that's actually Oak Ridge right there in the picture right there. This is it's the 18th today that I'm recording this. Starting on, I think, the 5th or 6th, I have an event in October almost every single night. So I will be posting both on my personal, but then also on Tripping on Legends, these events. I have the Haunted Hometowns event in a very general sense up on both of those, but I'll be pushing out the actual dates. I highly suggest you come see me. I'm going to be pretty much, except for the Panhandle, I'm going to be in every part of Florida. One event I'm actually doing in near Gainesville, so Belly Bridge, I'm going to get you. I'm sorry, not Belly Bridge, but UF. I've got 2 events in one day, staying overnight, and 2 events the next day. So that night seems like an amazing time for a legend trip. Follow the site so that you can get all of these different events that I'm going to be speaking at, and you can come out and you can talk about your haunted experiences in the haunted folklore of your town, or at least add to mine. Like I said, you can call the phone number at any time. The number is 813-418-6822. It's not just active during a show. So if you have a legend you want to follow up on, or you have something you want to speak about, or a story that you know, feel free to call that number. The website, which is still up, and I'm posting a lot of old, if you follow us at all, I'm basically taking every episode we've done and making its own page. So if you've seen a lot of posts, that's why. That is www.trippingonlegends.wordpress.com. I'm hoping to get a real website by the time the book's out, so you can kind of explore the travel logs and the pictures and the audio of the recording. Like, you read the story, which is very impersonal, or very like storyteller, and then go and see what happened when we actually went to those locations. So that's hopefully coming in the next couple of months. So if anyone is a web designer and wants to work with me, I would love to have you on board. That's pretty much all I have. So for Christopher Balzano, thank you for tuning in, and here's hoping that all your trips are legendary.